Jamde jambe yung la sha za lo kangge lo de dim nye den den nye dara nam da rab sarave jinye dun gun je jen za jere nye je du gara le wam ze kong da se jen re ma re men dam dung e je ze ve do so gun la pu je dar yin la ju ju yung den song du dara je du nye mon nye long le je cha Rādhā jīnā mārē mēsarā dōngrā nyūgū jīnā rādhā nām dēnē dāshīn sācī dārsūn yīndē lūsō jāsē dūyūgū chūntrā chūdān chūnyī jīndē dālū mēsā jāmbē yōng lā yīndū Sēdīn chēchē jīnrā hūsrā jē dālū dēmū mēn pārā srā nē Kātān dēn chū chōng lōi dō pāyē lō chū pōp bē nō wā zā dō sō Nam dā chū tīm sēr chē sā jē dēn dēn zēn pā mē rī līng kē bēn zē shērab nye dē nō wē chū gān sā rā tōm chōn chō wē lā mā shā gē yō rū Jāvyā shāna dōr jē jēn rē zē sā yē nyīm bō dibā nām bā sar nām gē nyīm bō chāmbā guñ dō zōng nye wē sē jēn jē lā gō shā tsar shē shē kā lā chīn rab jēn gu rā jē zē bē wē dōng dōr jē lēn lā pō gyār wē tēn bā guñ nē sān zē bē kā jū rīm bō chē lā shā jē wō Chödrak chöjen nelu ma noro wara jijin zingne chenpe yeshe je Rotso yi lai genge padra wa rikbi dur je tsarap yon je chao Laso tene ta dawa nyi shik zhen lai chöshe che dawa sanen de la chöshe che chung ma song Tene ta tering go tang patsu gyo re Ten senken namba tsangma ge kuzu detang yue batang tene ta chue senpe che na kun long tong kun che nambar ta go ne sero nangs.
So in terms of the explanation of this text, the 37 practices of a Bodhisattva, we've just had a 2 months break. Today we will continue with the explanations of the remaining part of the text. Khenpo Rinpoche welcomes everyone and hope that all of you are in good health and circumstances. And he begins by saying that when listening to teachings, reflecting upon their meaning or meditating, it is important that one pays detailed attention to why one does any of these 3 Buddhist practices of listening, reflecting and meditating, so that one's motivation for the practice one does is in accord with the teachings that one either studies, reflects upon or meditates on. And there, of course, one's behavior should also be in accord with the teachings that one practices. So it's about paying detailed attention to both one's reasons for the practice and one's behavior in connection with the practice, or one's behavior in general, because both the way of thinking and one's way of thinking and one's behavior are to improve in general, not only while doing the practice.
텐데인데 땅에 양양 휴대버에 yin 양 산득초도들이 군홍대 간데 고기여봐 최기 년배잖아 근처 간데 고기여봐 초점 주기.
Therefore, Khenpo Rinpoche will begin today by talking a bit about the details with regard to one's reasons for practicing. In this particular case, it's about studying a text which sets forth the various practices of the path of a Bodhisattva, as well as one's behavior as to words, thoughts, and deeds in that context.
대인데 에르나 나란소 다 대과침부 람레 슈베 공사기 왕도 땅네 다 단다 셰야기 추인데 대신기 추래 대생기 요버래 대인도 나란소 대친게 타마 땡안서 단다 셰베 추인데 대과침부 람지 냠니 요래 대생기 요래 닝기 요래.
So what happens during these lectures is that all of you are studying a text of the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. And when doing so, one needs to, as it were, conform with and adopt the principles of this tradition.
대니 용투 최생견데 심베투라 제당 렉처르다고 마임바 지금은 냠니 최고 되네 냠니 제에 대양 가섭 심진 탐제기 된두 나상제고 삼배 근호교에 하상 계신 분인 말이에요.
And here, in that context, the context of Mahayana Buddhism, in terms of one's main reason for studying, for in this case studying a text of this tradition, it should be that one attends the lecture in question, not as merely a lecture in general, something one listens to and then perhaps gives a bit of thought to the context and then forgets about. One never really integrates what was taught during the lecture. Instead, in the context of Mahayana Buddhism, for the studies to be fruitful, one needs to begin by correcting oneself so that one's reason for the studies in question, one's intention as it were, is the intention taught as a proper intention in this tradition. Namely, one makes an effort in terms of studying those teachings, not for one's own sake alone, but primarily for the sake of all sentient beings in number as vast as the sky.
Penna teaching church shagiyana. The Ninkin la tenne, Ninkin Gunung la tenne, the Tewachimbola, draw down Mindrosinkin, Chayu.
Kurang Chawari.
Chawati.
Chawari. So whether one's efforts in terms of studying, in this case a text of Mahayana Buddhism, if in conjunction with the actions of studying, there is the proper reason or reasons for the studies, those that reflect the principles of Mahayana Buddhism, then the studies are true studies of Mahayana Buddhism, as it were. This is the way one does studies in this tradition. Whether that motivation, just described in brief, isn't at hand. The studies aren't proper or true studies of Mahayana Buddhism, by way of the definition just given.
Perna Teshingi Chöde, Shayon de Taji, Jimpenda, Sancho Sem Tang, Ninja Chempo Tang, Shambe Sem, that is the shade Yorwa. That he gets at the Penimpora, some Ninkinjina. Takoran Yimbek up the la, I'm sure the Nimbo Chongare, there's some Natana, she's at the Togu or Mato. The teaching the Chagma, the teacher, the church teaching in a young, Yimbek go on with them.
Now, Mahayana Buddhism stresses a number of factors, that of generating the so-called Bodhi mind, the mindset which focuses on doing that by way of which, at one point in the future, one will attain Buddha, the enlightened state, for the sake of others, in order to be able to guide others to enlightenment. So that mindset thus involves so-called great compassion for others, great loving kindness for others. It's a mindset of both compassion and loving kindness for all sentient beings. This is the proper Mahayana Buddhist motivation for doing the studies of the text in question. Or this is to be the motivation, the proper motivation. There may be individuals who attend this and other lectures like this one because they think of the Bodhi mind as it's defined, and of great compassion and great loving kindness as nice qualities. And therefore, they attend a lecture which explains about these features without really adopting that mindset, without making efforts to change one's mindset so that one's mindset becomes the mindset called the Bodhi mind. This kind of person may, after the lecture, give a bit of thought to what he has heard, and then that's the end of it, as it were, in terms of adopting what was taught. And that kind of motivation is not the motivation of Mahayana Buddhism. So it's not the kind of motivation, or intention, which conforms with this tradition, the tradition of Mahayana Buddhism. And therefore, studies in that circumstance are also not proper or true Mahayana Buddhist studies.
Tene 당문에 전에 두시에 줄네 대칭기 삼당당랑 전에 최년발로 써는 pautume 봐야돼.
Whereas a person who has paid attention to motivation and made the efforts necessary to, at least to some degree, generate the Bodhi mind and therefore compassion for others and loving kindness for others, the person who has made these efforts and achieved a degree of the Bodhi mind, that person, when attending a lecture for the sake of studying Mahayana Buddhism, accumulates immense merit. This is something exceedingly virtuous.
Tene tagana 신게 근처기 차네.
가래기 차네?
근처.
근처.
근처기 차네. 최년백갑라. 나와 맞대봐. 나와 맞대봐니나 초요 말에 송.
Then you have the person's behavior, as it were, in terms of words, thoughts, and deeds, while attending the lecture given. And to sit in the audience and listen on and off, as it were, being distracted on and off, as it were, is not recommended. It's a kind of behavior, or one of the kinds of behavior, which contradicts the principles of the teachings that are given. So it's important to pay attention to what is explained.
Penane kabubyabachi gela chuchizmji lunayang nanglan rotubyo.
Think of the following example, which is given in order to illustrate just what was said about being distracted while listening, not listening properly, simply. That individual, in terms of whether having been a member of the audience will have an effect or not, is like a vessel turned upside down on which water is poured. No matter how much water you pour on a vessel that's turned upside down, it will never enter the vessel. The vessel remains empty. So that's an example which to some extent then describes the situation of a person who attends a lecture but who doesn't really listen to what is explained.
Teneyang chögi tsikdang tön tenzo yang lo le korma nang na yang teyan jön re song.
Then you have behavior in terms of reflecting upon what one has heard, reflecting upon the true meaning of the teachings given. Det machena tene.
Det machena Jänner songre.
And to not, and this would probably primarily refer to what one does having listened to explanations. Because obviously a lecture, there one sits in the audience while listening to the words of the speaker. And to afterwards not think through what the words spoken are about in detail, if not attempting to unearth the true meaning of the words that one has heard, then again, having just listened will not bring about progress on the path to enlightenment, in that one hasn't reflected upon the various perspectives and the various aspects meaning-wise of what one has heard. So that kind of behavior, to simply listen to a lecture, perhaps attentively, but never pay attention thereafter really, is also a kind of behavior which is not of Mahayana Buddhism.
대중 컨텐츠 차고여서나 네 샵돌와 샵 이공 복송아 저기 나온다. 축가세지 루나양 추데 대기면도가 된다고 차고
The example is, which describes this, is that of a vessel which leaks. You can keep pouring water into a leaking vessel forever. It will never really be full. The water you pour into the vessel passes through the vessel and then leaves the vessel. That's all. And that won't make for progress in terms of proper Mahayana Buddhist practice.
다가 난신게 빠추니 추기 통다다 삼나 땅부갑라 녀몽도 짠에 만들바 남지때 녀몽도 저셔나 껴레 녀몽도 만들바 쳇고.
Then in terms of someone who attempts to reflect upon the various perspectives meaning-wise of the lecture one has attended, also needs to pay attention to his mindset while reflecting, because if afflictive obscuring states, passion, aggression and the like, taint the reflecting mind, then again the practice of reflecting will not have the desired effect, namely progress on the path.
벤나테 컨텐츠 차고여서나 칼라 심부시우지 때 디난 두지루 야바나신 찬룩.
And the example which describes this is a delicious meal laced with poison. So again, that sort of behavior is also the kind of behavior one needs to do away with, because one will not, by way of reflecting while the mind is tainted by an afflictive or many afflictive obscuring states, gain any progress.
다가난 신기 냠린도 또또 제베 있나yan다. 되네 칼라는 두다바난 신 효과랑 두진도 장로고요.
So poisoned food is not something that one would want to eat because that poses a threat as to either falling ill or perhaps even dying because of the poison in the food. Similarly,
녀몽도 지금 내 산에 벤나 최시세대 신주로로
the mindset which is tainted by one or many afflictive obscuring states while, for example, engaging in the practice of reflecting will have the result of the practitioner taking a direction which contradicts the path to enlightenment.
벤나 다고름 지금 송어로 와. 최인도 마세나 송어지.
The well-known Tibetan Buddhist master Gampopa said the following: if one does not practice the Buddha Dharma according to the principles of the Buddha Dharma, then
최진 인성도 특별시 송어지.
then the Buddha Dharma may cause rebirth in a lower existence. So this is the possible effect of practicing the Buddha Dharma while one's mind is tainted by one or many afflictive obscuring states. So there the Buddha Dharma is not an antidote to suffering anymore. It rather works the other way around. It causes suffering. Of course, that's not because the Buddha Dharma in and of itself has some sort of function which triggers suffering. Not at all. It is just because the individual is not or hasn't been able to correct himself behavior-wise while attempting to practice the Buddha Dharma. He has allowed himself to let one or many afflictive obscuring states taint his mind during practice of the Buddha Dharma. So it's not because of the Buddha Dharma that this happens, rebirth in a lower existence. It's because of the practitioner's afflictive obscuring states.
Pena takyo nanjorba chenpo chegi homa tende songsu tanda karishu kala gyuwe yeda yuarwa
Kala gyuwe yeda kandishi gyuwe
kala gyuwe yeda sengene zolo zunchur gundu pane yuedeke nödang pe nika che tunke yeda kari chenchi yuare segyo tan re sengedrowa.
Now, in terms of Buddhism, you have detailed explanations to the many different types of sentient being that there are throughout existence, as it were. And one of them, the Sanskrit name of that category is the pretas. You have in each category of a specific type of sentient being many subtypes, and within this category you have the kind of preta who has unusual capacities, as it were, one of them being able to, like a magician a bit, generate or make for various manifestations of this and that in what seems to be a miraculous way to others who do not have this capacity. However, in the context of this type of preta, that capacity has come from the preta's own afflictive obscuring states in conjunction with practice of the Buddha Dharma, while letting the mind being tainted by afflictive obscuring states. And if one takes this in the context of, because preta may be a foreign word to some of you who are not familiar with these various categories of various sentient beings, in the context of the world, one speaks of ghosts, spirits, demons, and the like. Which is a description of sentient beings who are not human and therefore not always perhaps visible to all members of mankind, as it were, but who in one way or another make their presence felt, and usually in a negative manner. A ghost is something one fears, as it were. And this type of preta is this sort of non-human being who has this capacity. However, it's not a capacity that's entirely, or it isn't a capacity that make for benefiting others, rather the opposite, frightening others, and so on and so forth, though in some cases this type of non-human being may from time to time, perhaps in terms of being attached to someone, try to benefit that someone because of his connection with that someone. All in all, it's about a non-human being who has a capacity to either harm or to help.
Chö chebe tuna bana angune chane kunung de abuchi mesin de je to samra khana khansam jichane thar sincholo wal jechane yida tinde grijin jengin shira yode.
So while studying the Buddha Dharma and while reflecting upon the Buddha Dharma in terms of those Buddhist practices, it is very important that one pays attention to one's personal behavior in terms of words, thoughts, and deeds. Because if one's mind is tainted by afflictive obscuring states while doing these practices, the result may be a result which contradicts or is the opposite of what one tried to achieve. Namely, the rebirth, for example, of a non-human being of the kind briefly talked about.
Tagana shinge dike chambure penna chöla gunben du shedang jihad. Tanti Trikatsan technology gela choshe de do gumben do shete la wen yinga shuchi yore.
Another perspective that's important to pay attention to in terms of how one approaches studies, reflection and meditation in terms of the Buddha Dharma is to educate oneself and educate oneself about just how rare it is to have the opportunity to come in contact with the Buddha Dharma at all. Now, particularly in today's world, this point is important because of today's technology, where all kinds of information is readily available. It's very easy to lose sight of this point, because just by pushing a button, information is available to you. And therefore, there is no longer really knowledge of that. In fact, it is very rare to come in contact with a Buddhist doctrine at all. It seems very easy today. And also because of the ready availability, because of today's technology, it's also easy to develop wrong views.
Penna the YouTube jignan zusonda takora ninto tekpane dorje tekpa tartu pa shakchin da zoshin pa shenkin kunde do.
Now you just need to open the YouTube channel. There a massive amount of information is available in the context of both Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. And in Mahayana Buddhism, you have a specific section, subsection, called the Buddhist Tantras, and in that context you find the traditions of Mahaati and Mahamudra, for example. And in the YouTube channel you find so many people explaining both Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism and these two traditions of Mahaati and Mahamudra. YouTube channel is chock-a-block full of people giving lectures regarding these various parts of the Buddha's doctrine, Buddha Shakyamuni's doctrine. Tene denso teka shigiyomi chi sung songe.
Tene denso chi ni de gansam samre de che gönben do she ko yang la. Te nyamning gen do she ko la kanga la ong do wa. Yu shin ju lo ong do wa te du.
Re yin kyendi teka shema tu pe kyen re.
Re teka shema tu jön do wa.
Now a question arises here, as there are so penapöla den de marava chiki chikla gyne de shego gemare.
Te tanda mala de ne dis je de la.
Where was I? What did I just say? Sorry. Yes, a question arises here. All of those many individuals who expound these topics, in specific Mahamudra and Mahaati, are all of them qualified as to these traditions or not? That's a question that would arise. Now, as was said, there are so many lectures on the net available, and people click themselves perhaps from one lecture to the next and listen a lot on and off, perhaps. The risk one runs while doing this to sort of, I wouldn't say mindlessly listening, but listening without having adopted the principles of the practice, the features of the practice of listening to teachings. That may result in losing any understanding at all of the fact that true Buddha Dharma, it is very rare to come in contact with true Buddha Dharma. And in terms of then, in that context, having lost that appreciation of true Buddha Dharma, attempt to practice what one has heard, as to all these lectures one has listened to on the net. It would be very difficult to be able at all to do true Buddhist practice in this situation.
Perna neta jupan kajubege la pesi jan shubijina kajube lama kumatenzoke tene pene chösharje chembo sange de nyamne naya la kande chigena nongdo toetang gwenbendo ye shiwuji jena yore tanda nga kalba sangbo jene chö nalamdo gosong mato jige kalba gren la yang sonam masana ndeda kotu gumare sambendo she de semju de yode.
Khenpo, she would like to mention a bit about the details in the Kaji school of Tibetan Buddhism as to how the masters of old approached Mahamudra, which is primarily taught in the Kaji school of Tibetan Buddhism. All of them were keenly aware of that to at all come in contact with the true Mahamudra teachings, one would, in previous lives, have engaged in extensive virtue. Because without that, one simply wouldn't have had the fortune to come in contact with the true Mahamudra teachings. Therefore, those individuals knew just how fortunate they were in that they had come in contact with the true Mahamudra teachings expounded by a true master.
Tende gwenben doshe de semju de ye yong tu gwenben doshe de semju le chik pordu ta nyamne shebe tsena kaju bale yong ra le ke chen de segro ri bushes nabön chi köchens chong to ge tamsam la kur se
So, because of knowing this, of truly having understood this, in terms of them practicing the teachings they were given by true masters, they would remove themselves from the world or the affairs of the world in order to be able to fully focus on the teachings they had been given. Therefore, the saying of such practitioners, or rather naming such practitioners as the sons of the mountains, who wear the early morning fog as their clothing and who are not concerned with housing, food, clothing, and the like. Those practitioners, in terms of them applying to themselves to the teachings they had been given for the sake of mastering those teachings, these practitioners would go off to places of solitude in the mountains of Tibet with nothing. And their only purpose would be to master the teachings they had been given, and fully knowing just how rare this opportunity was. So this is what would characterize a person who has truly understood the meaning of, for example, this tradition, that of Mahamudra.
Tenjeke penna nyamning ki chedu tuila kale chön batala konsol kale zang sorgu yo mare chögün dushe gömben dushe telten.
Because of having fully understood just how rare their opportunity was, these practitioners didn't suffer because of the cold in their cave or because of not getting 3 meals a day and the like. To them, that was not a difficulty, simply because they fully understood just how rare this opportunity was.
Now,
in today's world, there are many people, when they hear about the life examples of those masters, who find it hard to believe that half of what is written in terms of their biographies is probably not true, it's an exaggeration. People have all sorts of ideas about the life examples and hardships that these individuals had.
Sanmastang Bina, Trikatsan, Ko Tanda Dirava, Parjeb, Dingdoa, Tandan Dragon Kava Chambuchre, Kuncho Jansen Rumbuchesingage, Kuncho Gatso.
Kuncho Gatso?
Yeah. Konange Nansam Mindo, Resek Kuncho Gatso, Songdo.
Resek?
Rese.
Rese?
Randu Resandu se.
There is a Drigung master of today, Khenpo Gyatso of the Rese family, a Drigung Kagye master.
The Kong Milare Pege, that Pepsa, then Jungne, Sama Zechin Parkun Pedigdoa.
He has taken upon himself to locate and to visit and to photograph each of the places known as places of practice of Milarepa, Tibet's great yogi.
Penanga Milarepa Namta Rigmund our Mongoching and Jenu Roa. That Pejet in Jugan on the Trafu, Sumchusonga, Semato, Yashegme. Kazan Kung Part Damn Tayon de Travu Yadang, up to Sijento, could say Koran Trafu Jungdo.
Now, Khenpo Rinpoche explains that he has read a number of biographies that describe Milarepa's life. And on the basis of having read those publications, he has come to know about 35 different caves where Milarepa lived and practiced. Now, this Drikung master, Khenpo Gyatso of the Reze family, he now travels Tibet and documents each and every place Milarepa has lived and practiced in, and according to his findings, to this date, he has found 150 caves. Caves or places of practice in the solitude of the mountains of Tibet. Now, one may wonder, why did Milarepa move around that much? What would have been the purpose of this? Well, it's quite simple. He felt forced to do so in order to avoid circumstances of distraction, because as old Tibet was an entirely Buddhist country, and the Tibetans very devoted to Buddhism and appreciative of masters, when they heard of masters who dwelled in the solitude of the mountains, they would, if they could, some for the purpose of doing the same, some for the purpose of seeking the blessing of such practitioners, travel to these caves. And if you then would have stayed, or in this case Milarepa, if he would have stayed in the same place all the time, it would have meant crowds of people on a daily basis, distracting him from his practice. And therefore, when he became, for his own taste, too well known in an area, meaning there were too many people seeking either his blessing, his consulting him about various things, or requesting teachings and the like, he would simply get up and leave and move on to another cave in an even more remote area in order to avoid any circumstances of distraction, because distraction will inevitably take the mind off the practice. And because of this style of practicing, as it were, the proper one, the one that's true to the Dharma, Milarepa did attain Buddha, the enlightened state, in one lifetime. Now, There may be people in the modern world who think, well, Milarepa lived approximately 1,000 years ago. One can't live like that today. Well, you're wrong. Still, practitioners of the various Kagyu schools do practice in this manner because they are set on actualizing a realization of the teachings they have received. And in order to be able to do that, this sort of, well, it sounds odd to say practice style, because it's not about one style or another, it's rather about true practice. That's what it's about. If you truly understand how fortunate you are to have encountered those teachings at all, if there is that initial understanding, then one would act in this manner.
Bad nange tiring khasang rang be shu na. Ta Jänner ta phog sansam tende chila jerung gelong ben nang la drung ka yu ku gamba chi do ga. Ti sho la tene ta magic kandan be sang chi ku push ko cho tan ren sing ge jin do wa. Ko thong go ta pe de chong ba che 총 잡 된대체 되는 예마 자나 용케 지탑 생게도 쭉 용도 지탑 그냥 그 레가 랭키.
Just a second. I can't remember the word. Just a second. There's a word for it. Yeah.
다 된대 그냥 레가 레 되네 고랑게 배다 모우 송뒤 된저 롭종 체 대제도 배대 가면에서 랑 미직 차도 하고.
Yes.
다 예마 고랑 공로 독주스 메시지를 다 된서 간간 넘주인 바 학원에 되는 저공의 야패 되네 사제 좀 뭔가된 게 특가 휴 되는 냠는 체
차차 쳔부 관계 차차
나된
nga dang dem pa
ya nga da dem ban jung gi sak chin de den sing nga da du gi yo
den sen nga de be
ire
la so
nga de yin song gre o ta ti chi shu de ni nyam ne nang tama kwarang pa yu le pep de gam ba ti na ne ta to che ko se de nyon do che de kwarang ge ten de nyon ba rang che de ta tam be so ko gam jo sho song re nyo song re se gi yo
yeah tene
다 니동 죽을 공시와 샤도아 tene tudam tsechi du jungdo ta nomber lukso tele tendege gengo lo jashu sen chan ro namsam mer saag mi do ta khatsin sha sa do da ta chinda chub gwa chji na isayo te kodong shu yon de pa jayo ko longba khong rinser ke doan rosa chunche rinser ke char pham do
duwa kande
도와 근데 치 근데 도에 넘에 린서 밥 되기도 텐데 첸데 시월 샤도 단 착진 게 냠는 빠서나 텐데 고고야로.
Now Khenpo Rinpoche gives an example of a person like this who lived today. He passed away in 2019 apparently. Anyway, there is an area of Old Tibet which borders with Old China, how the map looked before Tibet was annexed by Communist China. The name of the area is Jänner, and there is in this area a Drigung Kagyu monastery. There might be more, however, there is a specific Drigung Kagyu monastery where a true practitioner of Mahamudra, who mastered Mahamudra, he is, or was rather, because he passed away in 2019, associated with this monastery. The man's name is Khenpo Tamdrin, and he, of course, then lived through the period of China annexing Tibet and all of that. And as a profession, because as a young man, he wasn't a Buddhist practitioner, meaning he had not dedicated his life to the practice of Buddhism. He was a Buddhist, of course. However, he wasn't practicing, he was a businessman. Then later on, the annexation of communist China happened, and he worked in one of these large kitchens because in those days people were to settle in communities, and they had a large kitchen which fed the people of the community. People were not allowed to have private kitchens and the like. And Khenpo Tamdrin apparently worked in one of these large kitchens, organized by the Chinese in true communist style, and he studied the teachings of Mao Zedong, and apparently seemed to have done okay within that context. He hadn't been imprisoned or suffered too much. Now, at the age of 60, what the circumstances are, the story doesn't tell, or were, he realized his mistake in having adopted the communist doctrine and turned away from the Buddhist doctrine. Chakchingaden di sendu gompadela erego. And so he traveled to one of the main Drigung Kagyu monasteries in the part of central Tibet. He walked for 6 months to get there. Apparently, there he could meet with a Mahamudra master of the Drigung Kagyu tradition, and he received those teachings according to the Drigung Kagyu tradition, and apparently their presentation of Mahamudra is 1 in 5 parts. Now, he then, later on, having received the instructions and having set his mind on mastering the instructions he had been given, he lived in various places and practiced, and apparently at one point returned to the region of Jerong and settled in the Drigung Kagyu monastery there. Now, it appears that people would have found out about him being an accomplished practitioner and therefore sought his teachings, his blessings, and so on, which would make for distractions. To the point where he one day displayed a behavior of having fallen prey to mental disease, he appeared completely off and crazy. To the point, in a very believable manner apparently, so people then turned away from him thinking that they had made a mistake as to their judgment of him, or that he had practiced too intensively and therefore lost his mind, as it were. So he left the monastery and was then known as a person who had lost his mind in consequences of having made too much effort as to his efforts on the Buddhist path. He had over-exerted himself, as it were. Now, it's a fact, he passed away in 2019, which is very recently. Now, at that point, he was beyond the age of 80, and in this region of Tibet, the old tradition is to not cremate people of that age for quite some time after their death. Therefore, his body was cremated only in September of this year. It was kept till September of this year and cremated. The tradition is that the dead bodies then put on the high slopes, there is an area for it, of a mountain at a high altitude. It's presumably preserved best that way, and cremated later. And his body was cremated then in September of this year. What happened at the cremation was that smoke issued, of course, when cremating the body, and from the smoke that issued from the cremation fire, a rain of sacred substances fell. And then and only then was it realized that he had only pretended having fallen ill, become mentally ill, in order to avoid anyone bothering him in his efforts to attain a realization of Mahamudra, thus cancelling out any possibility of distraction. And this is the hallmark of a true Mahamudra master. And the very root of someone being capable of this kind of level of effort is that they do have a very keen understanding of just how rare their opportunity for realization is, and they will not waste it. So this sort of keen understanding of this rare opportunity is very important. Without it, the spiritual influence of the Buddha Dharma itself, the master and so on, you're not receptive to it really.
신랍 주고 세도 갈래지 고고 열었으나 서로 점들 신랍 세워 말해. 내 셈든 줄도 봐시.
Now, what is spiritual influence, popularly known as blessing? It's the clear knowledge of what one needs to do.
철와점 들라
det 말에
말한 심규된 줄투가시.
the clear knowledge of what I need to do in order to realize the teachings I have received, which means, or rather, which makes for a shift in one's mindset, a shift in the way one thinks, acts, speaks, and so on. A sensation of feeling good and so on is not what is meant by blessing or spiritual influence in terms of the Buddhist tradition.
But 심규된 줄을 세대 셈데 녀무 매로 말에 앉아서 하신 수 있는 녀무 요할때 녀무가 왕도 마셔와지 통보고요.
So what is this mind shift about? Well, instantly all of afflictive obscuring states won't evaporate and never arise again. Of course, that would be next to impossible. However, this mindset where this type of shift has happened due to spiritual influence is a mindset where the individual will no longer let himself be overpowered and guided by afflictive obscuring states. He doesn't allow his afflictive obscuring states to take over his mind. This is what spiritual influence is about. True spiritual influence.
Karma kunde jar. Karma pepe, karma himbo chana. Chaji te. Biscuit or cake tawache na. Karma himbo chana, shambo chechana. Nge sem de chiwuchen, sorwa chiwuchi yongudwa. Yin sorwa de yedugdwa. Sorwa de shin lab remindwa.
You see, if one takes the example of people who are perhaps devoted to the Karmapa, they have an audience with the Karmapa and he speaks very kindly to one. One is perhaps even offered a cup of tea and a biscuit or a cake. And the whole encounter is very pleasurable. So one ends up with a sense of well-being while there and for a while after, but this doesn't last, does it? No. Why? Because this is just a sensation of well-being, a pleasurable sensation. And a sensation is just a sensation. Sensations come and go. They do not make for a proper shift as to one's mindset.
Tille pen jang thai do jege ta tamga ingbon rabote metakpa singit takwa sungudwa.
And the present Karmapa, Trinlataja Dorje, emphasizes very much in all of the instructions he gives the importance of understanding impermanence. And here we can see that it's important to understand what impermanence is and how it works. In this context, then, of confusing a sensation of pleasure with spiritual influence, the individual lacks an understanding of impermanence because he or she doesn't even know that this is just a fleeting sensation of well-being or pleasure. It's not spiritual influence, as it were.
Karma besong metakpa singeta langa so samna ji yang do tang na ta. Takpa sem de yang do samna tang to be na nyomu ting go na kre.
Kanre song song.
Te metak bin do she ta takpa yang do sem ko to be na.
However, if one instead focuses on truly knowing impermanence, the effect of achieving that knowledge would be that one is able to at least suppress afflictive, obscuring states of mind as they happen. For example, to give an example that's very easy to understand, let's say you're out looking for a new pair of shoes, and you find a pair of shoes you like. If you're a person who really think of impermanence to some extent at least, you would then be a person who would ask yourself, well, if I buy this pair of shoes, will death perhaps strike even before I've been able to wear them? Is there a point in buying this pair of shoes? Then that sort of mindset which thinks in those terms, because it's a mindset which to some extent has understood impermanence, by way of that thought, attachment to the new pair of shoes has gone out of the window simply because one doesn't even know if one will have time or the opportunity to wear these shoes before dropping dead, as it were. So in this way one needs to practice so there is a level of shift in terms of how one thinks, how one acts, how one speaks, and so on. And at that point, the spiritual influence of the instructions as to impermanence given by the Karmapa may come to light in the mind of that person. And this type of person would understand that the one and only reason for him having been able to make this shift in terms of his mindset, how he thinks and so on, is because of the instructions of the Karmapa. And thus one becomes an individual or practitioner receptive to his spiritual influence. This is some of the perspectives of the workings of true spiritual influence. One knows that one has progressed and to some extent become a better human being because of the kind instructions of, in this case, the Karmapa. And a person like that, as was said, is then receptive to true spiritual influence, which will make for a positive mind frame in this life, as well as perhaps being guided at the time of death by the spiritual master, by the Karmapa. So that's all for today.